On the oldest street in Bracken Hollow, where the houses leaned together as if they had spent a century whispering to each other about the people inside them, Mara Vance lived alone in a narrow blue home with white shutters that creaked whenever the night wind drifted in from the marsh. Mara was a clockmaker by trade, a patient woman who believed that every strange sound had a reason if you were willing to take something apart and look closely enough. Most of her days were quiet, filled with the steady tick of broken watches waiting for repair and the faint smell of machine oil that never quite left her hands. Nothing in her life was particularly mysterious, which is why the sound that came to her door that night felt so wrong. Exactly at midnight, when the town clock finished its final chime, 3 heavy knocks echoed through her house. They were slow and deliberate, the kind off-knock that felt less like a visitor asking politely to enter and more like someone announcing they already knew you were there. Mara opened the door expecting to see a late traveler or a neighbor in trouble, but the porch was empty, the street silent, and the iron gate at the end of the path still closed. No footsteps, no shadows, nothing except the cold night air and a strange silver button resting on the wooden step. The button carried a symbol she had never seen before, a crescent moon split perfectly down the middle. Mara told herself there had to be a simple explanation, yet as she picked up the small metal piece, a strange feeling settled in her chest, the quiet but unmistakable sense that the knock had not been random at all, and that whatever had come to her door that night might not be finished. The next morning, Mara tried to treat the strange event like any other puzzle. She examined the silver button under the warm light of her workshop lamp, turning it over again and again, hoping some maker's mark or hidden hinge would reveal where it had come from. Instead, the symbol of the split crescent remained as mysterious as the knock itself. It was Jonas Reed who noticed her distraction when he visited later that afternoon. Jonas was the town's schoolteacher, thoughtful and observant, and he had known Mara long enough to recognize when something was bothering her. When she showed him the button and told him about the midnight knock, he didn't laugh the way she half expected he might. Instead, his expression grew thoughtful. He said the symbol looked familiar, something he believed he had seen once in the dusty records stored in the town archive. Their search through the old ledgers led them deep into the forgotten history of Elder Row, the street where Mara's house now stood. Long before the homes there had been built, the land had belonged to a sprawling estate called Halden House, owned by a strange inventor named Lucian Vale. The records described him as brilliant but increasingly isolated after the sudden disappearance of his young daughter many years ago. More disturbing than the story itself was a note scribbled in the margin of an old register. It described how, after the girl vanished, strange knocks began appearing at the doors of nearby houses every midnight. Those who opened their doors alone often wandered into the marsh by morning with no memory of how they had gotten there. At the bottom of the page, written in fading ink, were 7 words that left Mara, Jonas, and Elsie Thorn, who had joined them in the archive, standing in uneasy silence. The warning read simply, "When the knocking starts, do not answer alone." That evening, the 3 of them gathered in Mara's small house on Elder Row, each pretending to be calmer than they truly felt. The rain had begun falling lightly outside, tapping against the windows in a way that made every small sound feel more noticeable. Jonas carefully reviewed the records they had copied from the archive, piecing together fragments of a story that seemed half history and half rumor. According to the old documents, Halden House had burned down nearly a century earlier, taking with it most of Lucian Vale's inventions and experiments. Yet the midnight knocking had stopped only after several strange objects were gathered and placed within a hidden clock chamber somewhere beneath the estate grounds. The problem was that no one knew where that chamber had been built, and over time the land had been divided, rebuilt, and forgotten. As the night grew deeper, Mara began to wonder if the answer might be closer than anyone realized. The thought was still forming in her mind when the first knock echoed again. But this time it did not come from the door. The sound rose from beneath the floorboards, 3 deep strikes that rattled the furniture and made the lantern flame flicker violently. The second set followed a moment later, louder than before. By the time the third set sounded, Mara had already dropped to her knees near the fireplace where the vibration seemed strongest. With Jonas and Elsie helping her pry up a warped plank in the floor, they uncovered something none of them had expected to find beneath her house. Hidden under layers of old wood was a rusted iron hatch ring set into the floor, as if the house had been built directly over something far older. The air that rose from beneath the hatch was cold and smelled faintly of damp stone and extinguished fire. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The darkness below seemed unusually thick, as though it had been sealed away for generations and had no intention of welcoming visitors now. Mara lit a lantern and carefully lowered it through the opening, revealing a narrow passage sloping downward beneath the house. The walls were lined with aged brick, and somewhere deep below them came the slow, rhythmic ticking of a mechanism large enough that it echoed through the tunnel like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The three friends exchanged uncertain glances, but none of them stepped away. Whatever had been knocking on Mara's door had clearly come from below, and if the old records were even partially true, ignoring it now would only make things worse. With cautious steps they descended into the passage, the lantern casting long shadows across rusted gears embedded into the walls and strange mechanical symbols etched into the stone. Eventually the corridor opened into a vast circular chamber that had somehow survived beneath the ruins of the old estate. At its center stood an enormous clockwork machine unlike anything they had ever seen, a towering structure of brass arms, rotating gears, and silent pendulums frozen in time. 7 empty sockets surrounded the central dial, each clearly designed to hold a specific object. As Mara studied the silver button in her hand, the truth slowly began to settle in her mind. The button had not simply been left at her door. It had been delivered the moment Mara placed the silver button into one of the empty sockets. The chamber seemed to respond as if something dormant had suddenly stirred awake. A faint vibration traveled through the metal framework of the machine, and several of the smaller gears shifted slightly before settling again into stillness. The device was incomplete, that much was clear. 6 more objects would be needed before the mechanism could truly function again. As the 3 of them searched the chamber for clues, faint whispers began echoing through the space. At first the sounds were so quiet they could have been mistaken for wind passing through cracks in the stone. But gradually the voices grew clearer, forming the soft echo of a young girl calling out from somewhere unseen. The voice did not sound angry or frightening. Instead, it carried a sadness that felt almost unbearable. Then another presence seemed to form within the shadows near the far wall. The shape of a tall man slowly emerged, not fully solid but clear enough that they could see the outline of an old coat and the glint of silver at his throat. Whether the figure was a spirit, a memory, or something stranger none of them could say. But when it spoke, its words carried the weight of a century. It explained that the machine had once sealed a dangerous threshold opened by Lucian Vale during his desperate attempts to bring back his lost daughter. The 7 marked objects had been scattered when the house burned, and without them the mechanism that held the breach closed had begun to fail. If the remaining pieces were not returned soon, the knocking would spread beyond Mara's house until every door in the town answered the same impossible visitor. Over the next 2 days, Mara, Jonas, and Elsie searched nearly every forgotten corner of Bracken Hollow. Each object they recovered seemed hidden within places tied to the town's past, as if the scattered pieces had quietly waited for someone patient enough to rediscover them. A silver key hidden inside an antique music box led them to a painted glass bead concealed in the chapel bell tower. The bead contained a clue pointing toward the abandoned river mill where a delicate brass feather had been hidden within an old weighing scale. Piece by piece, the puzzle slowly came together. Yet as they gathered the objects, the midnight knocking grew stronger throughout the town. Some residents reported hearing footsteps on empty porches. Others swore they had heard someone calling their names from the streets long after everyone should have been asleep. Mara tried to remain calm, focusing only on the task in front of them, but she could feel the tension growing with each passing hour. By the end of the second night they had recovered 6 of the 7 objects needed to restore the machine. Only 1 remained missing, and every clue pointed toward the marsh beyond the edge of town. It was the same marsh where Lucian Vale's daughter had last been seen before she vanished. Standing at the edge of the tall reeds under the pale light of the moon, Mara realized that whatever waited for them out there was not just the final piece of the puzzle. It was the reason the puzzle had existed at all. The marsh was silent when they entered it, the water reflecting the night sky so clearly it almost felt like walking across the surface of another world. Guided by the strange pull of the objects they already carried, Mara led Jonas and Elsie deeper through the reeds until they reached a circle of half-sunken stones surrounding a dark pool. Floating at the edge of the water was a small silver locket, the final piece the machine needed. But as soon as Mara reached out to pick it up, the stillness shattered. The midnight knocks erupted across the marsh from every direction at once, echoing through the fog like the pounding of something enormous trying to break through an unseen barrier. The surface of the pool rippled violently, revealing a reflection not of the sky but of Halden House burning in endless silence. For a brief moment, the image of a young girl appeared in the doorway of the reflected house, while behind her stood the shadowed figure of Lucian Vale. In that instant Mara understood the truth. The inventor had never truly summoned his daughter back from the marsh. Instead he had opened a door into a place where echoes learned to mimic human voices, knocking patiently on the world above for decades. Gripping the locket tightly, Mara and her friends raced back to the chamber beneath her house as the knocking followed them through the earth itself. One by one, she placed the final objects into their sockets. The ancient machine groaned back to life, its great pendulum swinging for the first time in generations. With a deep metallic note, the mechanism pulled the lingering echoes back into the threshold and sealed it once again. When the noise finally faded, the chamber fell into a peaceful silence that felt almost sacred. From that night forward, the midnight knocking in Bracken Hollow was never heard again. Yet deep beneath Elder Row, the restored pendulum continued to swing steadily in the darkness, quietly keeping watch over every door in the town.